Hello and welcome to the Shepheard-Walwyn podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Brown. Shepheard-Walwyn is a campaigning book publisher based in London, England, whose purpose is to uncover and promote authors with new ideas to society's oldest problems. Today, we continue our exploration of Don Riley's classic, Taken for a Ride, Trains, Taxpayers and the Treasury, and we speak to Dave Wetzel. Dave is a former Vice Chair of Transport for London, and he's especially qualified to talk about the impact of Don's work and the work still to do. He spent his life working to improve transport and society in and around London, and even in official retirement, still campaigns tirelessly for a fairer economy and a more prosperous society. I just wonder for the listeners if you could just tell us what you did during your professional career at the time when you met with Don and became friends.
When I first met Don, it was, as far as I recall, was in Bournemouth. It was probably the late 1990s. It was at a conference. Professionally, I was running in Cornwall what I would call an antique shop, but if you'd seen it, you'd have called it a junk shop. And I was given a presentation on the law of rent, and Don was talking about the effects that the Jubilee Line had on his land values. And I don't know why, but we became sort of friends as a result of that first meeting. And our politics were totally different. I went on after that to be Vice Chair of Transport for London. I'd already been in the 1980s the chair of the GLC Transport Committee when Ken Livingstone was leader of the Greater London Council, and I did it for the whole 5 years of his administration. The only reason I went on the GLC, I'd had a background in politics and trade unionism and the cooperative movement. And Ken had approached me in the late 70s when I was candidate for the Labour Party in the 1979 general election in what was for the Labour Party the hopeless seat of Twickenham, which is now a Lib Dem seat. And Ken asked me to stand for the GLC, and I said, "Oh, no way! They're all stuffed shirts wearing pinstripe suits. That doesn't interest me at all." And he said, "No, Dave, we're going to have a revolution, and you've got to be part of it." And that's how I got involved in the GLC. I won a Tory seat at Hammersmith and got elected. And then at our first meeting, I was elected as chair of the Transport Committee. I was chair of the Transport Committee at the GLC. Then the GLC was abolished by Thatcher in 1986. And I got elected to Hounslow Council again. I'd already been a councillor when I was 21 years old. And the following year, I became leader of the council, and I did that for 4 years. Then, when that all finished, I went down to Cornwall with my wife. We ran this junk shop and also a restaurant. And then we moved back to London, opened the restaurant in Brentford, and Ken came to write a review for the Evening Standard, and he asked me to get involved in his campaign for mayor, which I was happy to do. And then for 8 years, he appointed me as Vice Chair of TfL. He chaired Transport for London. Transport for London runs the underground, the buses, registers taxis, in charge of all the major streets in London, gives grants to borough councils for road safety. And in fact, what we did, we were setting up Transport for London from 16 different separate agencies, and we introduced the congestion charge, much to the annoyance of many motorists, but and of course there were all words of doom and gloom if it was to be introduced, a bit like the words of doom and gloom we get about if we have land value tax, and but it was success from day one, and it's still there. I pride myself on the improvement to buses, particularly in that first year. I was chairman of London Buses, and we introduced 33 major changes. I won't bore you with telling you what all 33 were, but it was things like doubling the night bus network, improving the information, particularly timetables at bus stops, improving countdown, having it available on people's mobile phones, integrating the fares with Oyster, having 2 doors on buses. It seems so obvious now. You have a door for people getting on and a separate door for people getting off. Most of the buses we inherited in 2000 were single-door buses, and you couldn't board the bus until the people had alighted. And, of course, that delayed the bus at the bus stop and made the journey longer than it needed to be. We increased bus patronage dramatically as a result of that. And that was our second major achievement after the introduction of congestion charging. And Boris got elected, unfortunately, as Mayor of London in 2008. Boris Johnson, I refer to. And I was honoured by being the first person that he sacked. But during the whole of that period, I was in touch with Don Riley. I used to get invited to the Christmas parties he put on for his tenants, which were quite a dramatic affair, with Don dressing up in various costumes and bouncing from table to table in his way in short trousers and holding a gun, I remember, on one occasion. He was a real character who, if you read the book, he came from New Zealand. I think he had about 5 shillings in his pocket when he came to London, and became multi-millionaire. And he said he became a millionaire not through his efforts, but the efforts of everybody else in London whose work, activities, building better transport systems, particularly the Jubilee Line Extension, added to the value of his land. But it was almost an accident that he became a landlord. He had a business dealing with computers in Russia, and it needed more space, so he rented very cheaply, or he bought, I think, very cheaply, a warehouse-type building in Suffolk, and it was too much space for his little business, and so he rented the rest out. And it was only within a couple of years he realised he was making more money on the rents than he was on his Russian computer business. So he sold that and concentrated on acquiring more properties, very astutely, very successfully, but recognising all the time that it wasn't just his efforts that he was making money. It was because of the efforts of everybody living and working in London.
When you look at the success of the book, how surprised were you that it's had such an impact?
I think it's like most things. If the message is true and it's backed by facts, then it's bound to have an impact. Many of us promoted it in our own ways. whenever I gave a speech on transport, and I've given many, many speeches around the country and indeed around the world on most continents, I always had a slide with Don Riley and Taken for a Ride and mention the effects of the Jubilee Line, and always quote, I hope correctly, his figures, whereby, according to his back of the envelope exercise on land values, limited to just 1,000 yards around every station of the 11 new stations on the Jubilee Line Extension, the land values rose by £13 billion. And if memory serves me right, the cost of building the Jubilee Line was £3.2 billion. So just the land values within 1,000 yards of each of the new stations, the land value would have, increase in land value, would have paid for at least 3 new Jubilee Line extensions. And to me, that was always a dramatic part of the story I would tell when talking about transport to academics, to people in national government, people in local government, journalists, transport practitioners, whoever and wherever I could find an audience. And those numbers tend to stick. It's a very dramatic, and it's a conservative estimate, the total increase in land value. One, because rightly, Don took it from 1992, when the Jubilee Line was first passed through Parliament, to when it was opening. And of course, those land values have increased because of the Jubilee Line ever since. And also the catchment area is much wider, where, for example, Thamesmead is linked by bus on a 30-minute bus ride to North Greenwich Jubilee Line station. That increased land values in Thamesmead in southeast London, but that wouldn't show in Don's figures or Don's book because it was outside the 1,000-yard catchment area. And anybody that could commute by bus to one of those stations, land owners in those areas were increasing their rents. Of course, the farther you get away from the Jubilee Line, both in terms of mileage, but more in terms of time taken to get there, that increase in value decays until eventually there is no increase because people make alternative travel arrangements. But Don's figures are a dramatic conservative number, and I think we should all remember that when we're talking about Crossrail, which is now the Elizabeth Line, the Docklands Light Railway, which I was midwife to at the GLC. I struck the deal by which the railway was to be built with government and with the Docklands Development Corporation and with London Transport. I described it as a toy town railway at the time, but it did have dramatic effects. And what originally we spent about £77 million building now has been extended and expanded, partly because of Ken Livingstone when he was mayor, going to City Airport and things. It's ended up as a cost of over £1 billion with the extensions, and nobody would do without it today. Yet again, it was controversial at the time, and the Thatcher government really didn't want to spend money on it, which is why they limited us to this £77 million, which created all sorts of problems that I won't bore you with. But what I argued at the GLC, before we actually planned the stations, I said, when we've decided where the stations are going to be, we should buy all the land around those stations that we possibly can, and then rent it out afterwards to pay for the operating costs of the railway and to subsidise the building of the railway. And that was dismissed on the grounds that the GLC did not have the powers to use compulsory purchase orders to buy the land in order to be a land speculator. So we just left it for everybody else to be the land speculators. And the taxpayer picked up the bill. Same story as the Jubilee Line Extension. But fortunately, some of that story got from Don Riley's book, got into the Treasury, because we, as TfL, went to the Treasury to fund Crossrail. And Gordon Brown, when he was in charge of the Treasury, kept saying no. And maybe it was perchance that Alistair Darling took over. We were suggesting a site value rating or a local land value tax just for London to pay for the building of Crossrail. And the Labour government said they did not want a new tax on landowners. So Bob Kiley, who was our transport commissioner from America, he'd run the New York railway system and the Boston railway system. He and his experts looked at the current business rating system, and we went back to Alistair Darling and suggested that we should put a levy on the most expensive buildings paying business rates. And if I'm right, at the time we were talking about a 2.5% levy on buildings with a rateable value over £49,000 so per annum. So, and that's probably going back to values years gone by. So we were talking about buildings that were worth many millions of pounds, paying 2.5% extra levy. And interestingly enough, none of the owners of those buildings protested. None of them demurred from the idea of making this contribution, because they knew for every pound that they paid in extra business rates, they were going to make tens of pounds from the rents they could charge the tenants who rented the buildings from them.
And you're talking there about the decisions that governments make that either take away value from the community or add it. And when you look at Don's work and his book, which are the ideas that you think are still most relevant today?
Well, land value tax is the main relevant idea coming. That if we as a community create increased land value, and indeed we as a community create all land value, and so therefore we as a community should collect that land value instead of collecting taxes through income tax or taxes through taxes on trade such as VAT and sales taxes, or even taxes on profits. If you look at most profits that private companies make, perhaps not most, but a lot of it derives from land value.
Yeah. So, in your opinion, then, what do you think people will get from reading Don's book, especially the revised version?
I believe it's an education. It's entertaining. Don's own life story itself is entertaining, but it's also an education. And what is written is nothing novel, nothing unique, nothing that wasn't already buried in economic textbooks and buried on the internet that people couldn't pick up for themselves. But he distills it into this one major story. And he says some beautiful phrases. I'm not quoting directly from the book, but from memory. Things like he described how the building of the Jubilee Line Extension, the contractors needed premises to work from. And he rented one of his buildings to these contractors. And he asked, could he go down at night into the tunnel to see what they were doing? And they were only too proud and too happy to show him. So he spent an evening down in the tunnel, and he describes how these men, and they were all men in those days, were digging this tunnel, making it longer and longer, and they were sweating. They were only paid a reasonable wage for the work they were doing. They didn't even know where their next job would come from when that was completed. But all the time they were sweating and working, his land holdings in Southwark were rising in value in his sleep. And he wasn't having to lift a penny. In fact, he was gaining from it because he could charge rent for the use of his premises. And he describes how that was all most unfair. He could make money in his sleep. And he wasn't the first to say that. I think I might be wrong, but Winston Churchill described landowners making money in their sleep while the rest of the community worked to enable that increase in land value.
Wow, what a story. David, anything like you'd like to say to our listeners before we wrap up?
I would urge people to read Don Riley's book, Taken for a Ride, whether they're particularly interested in transport or not. Think of the lesson in the broader sense, not just looking for the increase in land values that do arise on good, well-used transport projects, but to also think about it in terms of good schools. Parents pay more for a house in the catchment area of a good school. That increase in value isn't because of the bricks and mortar are worth anymore. It's the location close to a good school. People will pay more for a lovely view of the countryside, or hopefully without flooding, to be near a river, or without the cliff collapsing, to have views of the sea. Well, it's not the landowner that has created the river, the countryside, or the sea. That is nature. And the fact that they're given a planning permission to put up a house is a community decision. The fact that there's a legal system that we pay for that gives them the entitlement to their deeds to actually hold that land free of other people claiming ownership to it is a community decision. And those landowners should be funding all the services that are needed, the legal system, the transport services, the keeping the river clean, maintaining the flood barriers, all of the services, our health service, our education services, our welfare services, should all be funded from land wealth, which is a much, much bigger amount than any economist will admit to. And I would suggest it is a huge part of GDP, much more than just the taxes we currently pay. And so my message to any person, specialist or preferably general readers, is to read the book and learn the wider lesson, to actively call for your MPs, your councillors, your elected government, demand, not just call for, but demand as a human right, as a point of justice, say none of these landowners created the planet on which we live. Demand that the wealth of land which is created by all should be shared by all, and we shouldn't be penalised by having the government, the inland revenue, stealing our money from our wage packets even before we've taken the money home or before we've even opened our bank account to see what's been credited.
Well, Dave, just to paraphrase or to quote Don, I'm sure some of our listeners may disagree with some of the things that you've said, but I'm certain that they agree on more than we disagree. So your passion and your intelligence and your commitment to society and making things better is evident in our conversation. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Jonathan.
To explore these ideas further, be sure to visit Shepheard-Walwyn.com and join our mailing list for news and special offers, and also to buy the books. So until next time, keep reading.